Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs analyzes how tight supplies of beef could impact prices. Stephen Wegulo describes winter wheat problems appearing in some parts of Nebraska. Bob Wright explains how producers can scout their corn and soybean fields for common stalk borer and bean leaf beetle. And Tamra Jackson-Ziems gives us an update on corn seedling and disease issues. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. As you've heard in our last few interviews with Mike, the feedlot industry, after a long stretch of drought-related losses, is seeing solid returns. A tight supply has helped increase profit margins, but it's also now heating the market for feeder cattle. Those futures are hanging around record levels. A feed ration for those animals looks to be off to a good start as the country's corn farmers are on pace with their 5-year planting progress average. However, another part of those diets, distillers' grains, are becoming more competitive. Reuters says China imported more dried distillers' grains in April than any month in the past, and most of it came from the U.S. The country brought in more than 600,000 tons of DDGs in April, up 252% from a year ago and 40% higher than March. Here at home, the U.S. is coming off a big demand weekend when beef producers anticipate consumers will buy meat for grilling. They may have paid as much for it as they ever have. The Beef and Veal Consumer Price Index has increased nearly 10% in 2014 alone. It's the largest 3-month increase since 2003. We started our discussion with Mike Wednesday morning by asking for his thoughts on how price and supply affected demand over Memorial Day weekend.
Really haven't heard, but the thing that was in our favor is tremendous weather pretty much throughout the country. They had nice weather in the Northeast, which they haven't had forever. So I'm hoping there's a little pent-up demand there to go out and grill, but because you had the holiday, some of those numbers are slowed down. So really haven't heard what clearance has been, but hoping it's good.
Yeah, describe to me how high feeder cattle prices have been.
From the ground to the moon. It's amazing, and they just keep ratcheting it up. And once again, the incredible feed yard industry that I'm in, we're probably the only industry in the world that takes all the money out of their raw product, but we do.
Margins now are good, yes?
Margins now for cattle that you had in the yard are excellent. Yeah. I would say probably all-time records.
But if you're buying at what the feeder cattle prices are at now, could that threaten profit margins?
I think if you're not careful, if you're really running around out there like a drunken sailor, I think you could give back some of what you've gotten. It's going to depend a lot upon what kind of corn crop we have. If we have a really good corn crop, you know, your cost of gains are going to go down and you're going to be fine, I think, because going into the fall, we're not making any more cattle.
Yeah, April placements were 5% below a year ago. Is that an indication of supply, or is that an indication that people are still holding?
No, I think absolutely it's an indication of supply. The cattle, the feeder cattle just aren't there, and they're going to continue to get tighter. So I think I see you're going to have an increase in slaughter numbers here for the next 60 days. That's going to be an interesting thing. After that, we're going to get really tight cattle, and we may get extraordinarily tight October, November, because that's where these placements that are down on go. So I think you could have a serious problem as you get in the fall, but these next 60 days are a pretty big hurdle to get over, I'm afraid.
You say slaughter numbers are going to be higher because?
Increased supply of cattle. This is the seasonal deal. We have a lot of calves that go June and July, excuse me, and I think those numbers are there, and they talk like we may even have a higher slaughter number than we had last year, with bigger cattle. So you could potentially have a rather large supply of beef that's going to be pretty expensive. Now maybe it won't be as expensive as it's been the last 60 days, but it's going to be expensive, you know, compared to history.
Right, and we know that the cattle are getting bigger. You look at the last slaughter report, while production was 4% below the average cow is 10 pounds heavier on a live weight basis. That's nothing surprising. We've talked about that before in the past. Great weather, and every year our genetics improve. We've had record performance. And that's what's interesting to me. You see a lot of these guys that write letters saying, well, these cattle are big, people are obviously holding cattle. Nobody's holding cattle. Cattle are going 2 and 3 weeks early. The weather has been so good and the genetics have gotten so much better, we're able to make these cattle bigger, they're more efficient on their feed, and you've seen what grading done. Grading has gone up considerably, so we're doing really well from that standpoint. Where do you expect corn prices to go now?
Well, it's all up to Mother Nature. You know, we talked about it last time, I believe. At one point, everybody's going to realize, hey, the corn crop's going to get planted. We're there. We've taken, I don't know, 40, 50 cents out of this thing. I don't think it just goes straight down, but it could just keep grinding that way if Mother Nature is favorable. Now, so far she's been favorable, but you always have a hot stretch, hot, dry stretch in there. You always have it. It's going to come. And depending on what your managed money does, it could really get wild. That's one of the things why the market has gone down so far so fast. A lot of the managed money has left.
Yeah.
I think it's a little early to run corn down any further than what we have. But, you know, as long as Mother Nature takes care of us, I don't think it has any other direction but down.
How affordable are distillers' grains right now? You know, you look at data from China that April was a huge month for them. They always want to buy. What does that do for price and supply here?
It makes it very difficult for us because we want to buy distillers' grain on a relationship to corn, preferably cheaper. You know, 85, 90% the price of corn delivered to feed yard would be magical. And we are not able to get that done, and it's because of China. They're buying so much of it, and until they get their foot off the pedal, I'm afraid we'll have a little problem there getting distillers grain in at a price that we would like and be able to feed it at a level in the ration we like, because we're feeding it at minimum levels. I think most people are, because relative to corn it's way too high.
We'll close out talking about prices in the grocery store. We were talking before we went on here about some of the prices we paid over the weekend for beef. What do you think we could see in the grocery store for a price?
I think you're going to continue to see hamburger ratchet up, because that is the #1 product that customers want. They want hamburger. It's easy to cook. People don't know how to cook very well anymore. A roast is hard to cook and it takes time to cook. Hamburger's fast, it's easy, it's multiple, it can do a lot of things, and people like it. And I think, at least at this point, they're willing to pay for it. So that's what we're going to see. I think the retailer is going to keep ratcheting up that hamburger. And you may see your steak prices kind of flatten out a little bit, but I think hamburger's just going to keep going. And in a way it has to, because we don't have the lean meat supplies we need. We're having to grind the end meats on these cattle, which for me I think is fine. So I think that's a good thing. That just gets more product off the market.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will analyze corn and soybean markets a week before the June crop report. And University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain will look at hog markets. Related to the swine industry, there was confirmation this week of a hog farm re-breaking with the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. According to a Reuters report, an Indiana veterinarian confirmed a farm in that state suffered its second outbreak of the PED virus. This would reject the idea that a farm which caught PEDV would have any long-term immunity from the virus. Reuters says genetic sequencing was exactly the same as the previous strain, and the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, or AASV, confirmed to Reuters about 30% of infected swine farms have suffered a second outbreak. The veterinarian says the death losses were less the second time around, with a death rate of about 30%. The most recent numbers from the National Animal Health Laboratory Network show the number of positive PEDV tests has declined for the 5th straight week and is the lowest since early January. 30 states have now recorded a positive case. Nebraska's winter wheat crop was rated 40% good or excellent in the latest USDA state report, but there are problems now popping up in some of the state's fields. UNL Extension plant pathologist Stephen Wegulo joined us Thursday at the Havelock Fields on the northeast side of Lincoln. Stephen says Fusarium head blight and rust could be issues, but we started by looking at the prevalence of bacterial leaf streak.
We have seen it at Mead, mostly in the University of Nebraska research plots, and here in Lincoln and in those two locations it's quite widespread. I have not seen it so much in growers' fields, but you know, some of it, we are likely to see some of it in growers' fields, but it's not, it tends to occur most of the time in breeder nurseries because they have lots of different susceptible material there.
How hard is bacterial leaf streak to diagnose?
It's difficult because it resembles septoria, which is a fungal disease. And we can control septoria by applying a fungicide, but we cannot control bacterial leaf streak by applying a fungicide because it's a bacterium. So it's very important that we make a correct diagnosis, and the best way to do it is to send a sample to the plant and pest diagnostic clinic here in Lincoln, and then we can make a positive identification.
Is there management that producers can use next time when they plant wheat into those fields?
Yes, yeah, because the bacterium is mostly seed-borne, then for the next crop, use certified pathogen-free seed. That's the most effective way to control this bacterium. You cannot control it by applying a fungicide because it's not a fungus.
Are you noticing any foliar diseases popping up?
There have been foliar diseases. In terms of fungal diseases, we were on the dry side most of the spring, and so these fungal diseases have just been very slow to develop, and we have seen a little bit of tan spot and septoria, but not a lot. So for the most part, wheat fields are clean as far as foliar fungal diseases. And so, just yesterday we confirmed leaf rust in south central Nebraska, and it is just starting to develop, but we have had very little inoculum or spores blow up from the southern states because that's where we get the rust from. So the risk for damaging levels of leaf rust or stripe rust is low because the inoculum from southern states has just been very little, and we have also been on the dry side.
Fusarium head blight, is that a problem right now?
Fusarium head blight could be a problem depending on where you are. We had some heavy downpours during the Memorial Day weekend, and during that time wheat was just headed or flowering, starting to flower. That's the stage when wheat is susceptible to infection by Fusarium head blight. And so those areas that received heavy rainfall during the Memorial Day weekend, they should be on the lookout because the risk for Fusarium head blight could be high in those areas. And so right now what we are recommending is, because you have now detected leaf rust and some of the foliar fungal diseases like tan spot and septoria are, maybe developing because of that rain, we are recommending that if you are in an area that had heavy rainfall, you apply a fungicide that will target both Fusarium head blight and leaf diseases. And there are two products that are effective on Fusarium head blight, Prosaro and Caramba. Any other fungicides, they would not be as effective on Fusarium head blight as Prosaro or Caramba. But these two fungicides are also very effective, excellent on foliar fungal diseases. So they are the best choice to target both Fusarium head blight and fungal leaf diseases, including rust.
You can find more information on wheat diseases on the Crop Watch website. On the Market Journal homepage, you can also find a link to a segment we did last year explaining how samples are submitted to UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab and analyzed for diseases. We told you leading up to planting season how Nebraska Soybean Board funded research showed soybean planting dates had an important relationship to yield. The latest USDA Crop Progress Report shows Nebraska's soybean farmers have made quick work putting their soybeans in the ground with 88% completion, 12 points ahead of the state's 5-year average and second in pace only behind Louisiana. This week's warm weather will likely make the latest emerged numbers obsolete in both soybeans and corn by Monday's report. With most of the plants now out of the ground, we talked with UNL Extension entomologist Bob Wright on campus earlier this week to see how growers can scout for bean leaf beetle and common stalk borer. We started by asking why common stalk borer is an issue at this point in the growing season.
It has to do with the life cycle of the insect. They have one generation a year. The eggs are laid in the fall and they hatch out in the spring. And typically they start growing, the caterpillars start feeding in brome grass or other small stemmed weeds. And they get to a point where they can't grow any further inside the brome grass stem, and so they start migrating to look for something else. And if you have corn or other field crops next to the brome grass waterway or a brome grass area where they overwintered, they start moving into corn at this time.
What happens when they move into that corn? How does it affect the plant?
Okay, they can either tunnel down into the whorl, and sometimes they kill the growing point, or they can just bore through the side of the stem of the stalk and kill the whole plant. So that's what you look for, is initially damage to the whorl leaves as they emerge, or maybe a dead whorl from where the caterpillar bored down into the whorl and killed the growing point, or dead plants, and you can see where a caterpillar bored into the side of the stem. And how does a farmer decide if he or she should treat for this? Okay, we have thresholds, and we'll have an article in the next issue of Crop Watch, but it varies with the crop value and insecticide costs, but and crop growth stage, but about 5% of the plants damaged is a rough threshold in corn, that if you have that many you need to treat. And if they are restricted to the field border, you can maybe get away with just treating the field border where they're heaviest and save some money that way.
Can these impact soybeans at all?
They will feed on soybeans, but they're not as important on soybeans as they are in corn. It has a very broad host range, so you can also find them in your garden on tomatoes and peppers and potatoes as well.
Let's talk about bean leaf beetle. What soybean fields would be susceptible to this pest?
Yeah, typically early planted fields, or maybe fields next to alfalfa are the ones that are most at risk. The bean leaf beetles emerge pretty early before soybeans do, and they'll start feeding on alfalfa or other legumes first, and then as soon as the soybeans emerge, they'll start migrating in there. Another thing to watch for is if you have alfalfa and soybeans nearby, after the first cutting of alfalfa, they may leave the alfalfa and move into soybeans.
And what can they do to the soybean?
Well, they are leaf feeders. They can heavily defoliate the plants if they're abundant enough. You need to have about on an average, field average of 2 bean leaf beetles per plant probably to be treatable at this time of year.
Has Nebraska been doing a good job of keeping an eye on these, or at least have they been minimized as a problem in fields?
Well, a couple of things. The hard winter we had, especially in the northern half of the state, probably reduced their numbers. And then the neonicotinoid seed treatments we have now on soybeans and corn are used very broadly. They're systemic within the plant, so they're also suppressing the adult bean leaf beetles when they feed on the plants.
As Bob mentioned, you can check the Crop Watch website for common stalk borer treatment options. We'll link to that information on the Market Journal homepage when it becomes available. Steve Weiss hopes his new beef barn and attached home can serve as a model for feeding cows or a way to help bring young farmers into the beef business. Weiss's unique, mostly self-contained production system near Crete is featured in the June Nebraska Farmer. It's built in a center pivot corner with a feed for his cows coming from irrigated and dryland crops and forages. With the attached home, Weiss hopes to attract university interns to the operation to learn more about it. You can read about the new barn, feeding system, and the use of alternative forages in the June Nebraska Farmer. UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems joined us earlier this week in Columbus to look at potential problems in the state's cornfields. Tamra says growers can be sampling their fields for nematodes and watching for Goss's wilt in areas where storms may have damaged plants. Tamra says while seedling diseases have been minimal so far, large amounts of rain in pockets of Nebraska could provide an opening.
You know, we've had a lot of wet weather, and certainly ponding in fields is going to be conducive for certain seedling diseases like Pythium. And just because we've gotten warm doesn't mean we're necessarily completely out of the woods yet. But with that said, no, we have not seen widespread seedling diseases like we expected this year.
Are there certain pathogens that do like the warmer weather?
Absolutely. We've got things like Rhizoctonia and Fusarium and all kinds of pathogens that will take advantage of this type of weather. So we should still keep on the lookout, but we're probably getting out of that time period.
In addition to some of the multiple inches of rain that parts of Nebraska have seen, there have also been issues with some damage from storms. In those areas, are things like Goss's wilt more of a concern?
That's a good point, because most people do not always think about Goss's wilt starting early in the season, but it really can be a big problem early in the season too, particularly so in fields that have sustained some damage from hail or high winds. And so if you had corn that had already emerged prior to some of those storm events, that would be something I'd certainly want to watch for. If Goss's wilt develops, and it develops early in the season like we are now, it can lead to some systemic disease and some of our bigger Goss's wilt losses.
A lot of times we talk about this maybe in July and we look on bigger plants and bigger leaves, but can you give us a refresher of what you should be looking for in those fields?
Normally for Goss's wilt, we look for the dark green to black freckles on the edges of water-soaked lesions. You might also notice that the surface of the leaves might look glossy when you look at them under the sunlight. That can show up early in the season. It's more common though to see a systemic wilt this early, and when that happens, the entire plant can just melt down in a matter of a day or two. And so when you cut that open, you'll see some discoloration inside. You mentioned that Goss's wilt can be really damaging at this point. How damaging could it be? Well, particularly when we have Goss's wilt develop early in the season at a seedling stage, Goss's wilt will actually often kill the plants before they ever get to a reproductive stage, and so we often have dead plants or carcasses in the field, and then secondary problems like weed pressure and other things develop thereafter in a severe situation. Not as common though. Is it too early to start sampling for nematodes in cornfields? No way, actually. This is probably the best time for people to be thinking about sampling for nematodes of corn, especially if you have sandy fields. In particular, the nematodes that can survive and feed on corn in sandy fields are going to be ones that can travel deep in the soil, so this is the best time to catch them when our roots are still shallow. And so we recommend sampling corn by the time they are at the 5-leaf stage or V5 if you want to look for nematodes of corn, especially in sandy fields. Otherwise, in our other soil types, you could even wait till the end of the season after harvest. To make sure you get the best results possible, if you send a plant into the lab first, we'll talk about sampling after, but if you send a plant into the lab first, what do you want that sample to be like? We want that sample to be as alive and crisp as possible, and so make sure you take good care of it. Treat it like you would the produce that you purchase at the grocery store. Bag it in plastic, keep it cool if possible. Don't allow it to get too hot. Ship it early in the week too, so it doesn't sit over the weekend. And if you're sampling for nematodes? Especially some of the same recommendations. We want the freshest sample possible because we need the nematodes alive. And so handle those samples gently, keep them in plastic, keep them cool when possible, and always sample from within the root zone. And this time of year you can also collect whole plants and send in those whole plants in a separate bag, and we can collect nematodes from both the plant and the soil itself. For more information on Goss's wilt, sampling for nematodes, and other corn disease problems you may experience throughout the growing year, you can visit marketjournal.unl.edu/corn diseases. There you can view a series of videos featuring Tamra explaining corn disease issues in Nebraska. As we mentioned earlier, we have information on sending samples to UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic available on our website. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this past week, of course, we dealt with the strong upper air low pressure system that slowly migrated out of the desert southwest and into eastern Texas as we got toward the midweek period. During that time frame, we've seen a daily development of thunderstorm activity in Texas, and then some of that did make it its way into Nebraska. The best precipitation that we've seen was, of course, across the portions of southeast, east central Nebraska and southwest Nebraska, with more isolated to virtually no precipitation for the remainder of the state. Further south in Texas, not uncommon to see reports coming in anywhere from 5 to upwards of 9 inches of moisture. In parts of western Texas, this represents more moisture than they received in the last year. So very welcome moisture. They'll need more of it, of course, to break this long-term drought. But for us, that moisture means that we'll start evaporating into the atmosphere, and so systems that are working in from the west will have an additional source of moisture to work with. And in fact, we do have another system coming in this weekend, and if we believe the models, it looks to be a very juicy period for a good portion of Nebraska. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we go through this period. And the one thing I'll draw your attention to is here we have this trough and we have a ridge to our south. So we've got the heat and the humidity building into our region. and we have the energy coming out of the southwest going to interact with this air mass to generate periodic thunderstorms. So for today, the best opportunity for thunderstorms will be the development this afternoon, this evening across the northwestern part of the state, some of that sliding into the western one-third of the state by the daylight hours, and much lesser chances as you move eastward. So as we get into Sunday, we'll notice that trough makes a little bit closer progress to eastern Nebraska, so the vast majority of the thunderstorm activity that breaks out primarily during the prime heating hours of the day, mid-afternoon to late evening, will be once again across the panhandle, and more of this is likely to slide toward eastern Nebraska, giving us an increasing chance of precipitation. As we go into Monday, we'll see that another piece of energy moves across the northern plains. We start to get this flow that moves from west to east from the central Rocky Mountains, and we have this upper air low energy. So systems are going to ride up over top of the ridge and then straight across Nebraska, giving us a very good shot of moisture on Monday. And as we go into Tuesday, we may get a slight break before some more energy ejects out late Tuesday night into Wednesday, and we'll see that the same system remains in place. So another piece of energy moves out on Wednesday. We get another piece of energy moving out on Thursday, and more importantly, we start to get a trough moving in on Friday. So overall, daily thunderstorm chances, if we believe the quantitative precipitation forecast for the 7-day period, we would expect to receive across the northeastern 2/3 of the state over 2 inches of moisture, with isolated pockets up to 3 inches. In the southwest and southern panhandle, we'll be looking more in the 1.5 to 2 inch range. In terms of temperatures, we are consistently going to be in the upper 80s to low 90s across extreme southern Nebraska, and more into the low 80s to upper 70s across northern Nebraska with those thunderstorm chances. 8 to 14-day forecast indicates above normal temperatures to our east and our west, and in terms of precipitation, we still continue a very wet trend, and that looks to continue all the way through at least June 11th.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews on cattle markets, winter wheat diseases, common stalk borer and bean leaf beetle, and cord seedling and disease problems can be found on the Market Journal website and through our Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Jeff Peterson will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Ron Plain will look at hog markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The Soybean Checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.